It is Africa Day special on New Central Television, and this time around we want to look at the economy and how we can boost the commerce of the African continent with the AfCFTA agreements. My name is Lekon Obanjo, and this is how I start. In the wake of the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement coming into force, leaders across the continent are expressing new optimism on the opportunities it holds for accelerating the growth and development of the region. AfCFTA, initiated by the African Union in 2018, seeks to create a single market for goods and services and a customs union with free movement of capital and business across the continent, among other goals. Now, the agreement has been signed by 54 of the 55 member states of the African Union, representing a combined market of more than 1.2 billion people and a total gross domestic product of over $2.5 trillion. In a recent conference on the theme of the AfCFTA, Africa's path to economic recovery and integration, various leaders highlighted the urgency of ensuring full implementation of the agreement, including developing policies and programs that will spur private sector-led growth, expand livelihood opportunities, and create jobs for young people and women. So this morning, joining me is Gospel Obele. Of course, is an economist from Streetnomics. Thank you so much, Gospel, for joining us. We will have another guest if we can accommodate him, but then, Gospel, it's nice to have you join me.
Thank you so much, Lekon, for having me. Really great to be here and speaking with you on such a day.
And okay, I'm being intimated that Andre Rowe, of course, is the professor of economics, University of Stellenbosch Business School, also joining us and joining the discussion. Thank you so much, Professor, for joining us.
Thank you. Good morning. Good morning to all our listeners and colleagues. And I'm speaking from London, where we are actually celebrating Africa Day with a few events, which I'm facilitating.
All right, that is beautiful to know. Now, I'm going to start with the professor. The AfCFTA was initiated to actually create a single market for goods and services and to also enhance intra-African trade and equally boost economic growth across the African nations. Has it achieved anything since January 2021 when it was created?
Well, if I can start, I think let's start off by saying that the idea of having a free market area is a wonderful idea. It's the first time ever, of course, that all countries in Africa have agreed on such a thing. As you pointed out, it does create the largest free market area in terms of numbers of countries, numbers of people on this planet. The proof is in the pudding. Obviously, abolishing tariffs or abolishing 90% of tariffs is an important component of this agreement. And I suspect that in the wake of COVID and other issues, maybe we've not made as much progress across the continent as we would have liked, but it's early days yet, and we'll certainly hope that by the mid-2030s, we'll start seeing some really meaningful progress regarding growth, job creation, intra-African trade, inter-African trade, and the like.
Of course, we know that there are challenges, but then let me ask Gospel. Now, looking at the AfCFTA, which was built and meant to attract increased investment into the continent, to also foster innovation and knowledge sharing, and equally to create new job opportunities, just as the professor has said. Now, how do you think this agreement can be accelerated and, of course, fast-tracked to ensure that Africa's development comes in earnest?
Thank you once again for having me here. I think that it's a, first of all, fantastic agreement, really, really smart in terms of the potential to position the regional market to be more competitive on a global scale. However, there are a lot of very nuanced in-context dynamics that need to be in place structurally, institutionally, then when you look at the legal framework of things, and then positioning of the critical stakeholders to start with. You want to talk about the SMEs in the region, and ensuring that they have strong access to market, access to finance, and technology support solutions, and all of these things. So it's important that that we begin to dimension these needs across different markets, and then tailor solutions within those contexts and harmonize them more regionally. It makes sense to have the AfCFTA as a broad agreement, but in my own lens of things, the execution of it will be largely within the contextualized markets, aggregating towards the regional bloc. In many times, African countries are very much different across the economic fundamentals, although very similar in terms of economic profiling and economic reality. But when it comes to executing economic growth and development and competitiveness per context, then we need to look at these contextual elements across the thematic points that I've raised, and then aggregating them in sync across the African economies, and exporting that competitiveness into the global market. So a lot needs to be done across these regional thematic issues, and once we begin to fix them more structurally with the right political will and institutional reform, then we'll be able to tailor growth and potentials within the sectors more progressively.
Gospel, you talked about contextualizing the implementation of the AfCFTA. And we know that African countries, not only African countries, countries all over the world have different growth and development status or bar, as it were. The growth level differ, as it were. So how do you think that these African countries, because what we're looking at is how to bring all the stakeholders together, and like you said, to harmonize operations, synergize resources, and see how to fast-track the implementation of these AfCFTA and improve the growth of trade, commerce on the African continent. So how do you think that these African countries can be at par in terms of their growth? Because, of course, if they have a same level of growth and they're able to drag each other along, it will be able to accelerate the process of ensuring that the AfCFTA comes to bear.
I mean, thanks a lot, Lekon. Different African nations are on different rung of the developmental ladder to start with. As a result, have different growth trajectory, towards achieving growth to start with. And that's one thing that we've not been able to identify and accept as a region and as a people to facilitate a regional focused growth. All right. Now, that said, I think that the AfCFTA goes beyond just signing of agreements. Each nation have to be individually, bringing themselves to the negotiation table with what do you have to offer, with items you have to offer, with other internal context-focused solutions around the thematic areas identified, which is access to finance, access to market, technology adoption, scaling non-oil stakeholders, especially the MSME market and all the like. So by the time we begin to fix all these regional blocks of issues, then we can tailor growth for each context and then tie up to the regional context in line with what the AfCFTA seeks to offer. So it's going to be a bit tricky to look at the AfCFTA as a one-size-fits-all approach for achieving growth in the region. We've tried it many times with different trade agreements under the ECOWAS and many other interesting schemes that has been rolled out in the past, even sub-regionally, but we've not been able to do much around it. And that's because the countries themselves are not positioning as strong industrial forces, bringing their best foot on the table beyond signing agreements, to facilitating the growth that the region needs much more holistically than what we have right now.
All right, let's go to Professor.
Can I come in here, please?
Okay, fine, you can.
I should actually agree wholeheartedly. One size doesn't fit all. And an additional complicating factor, of course, is what is often called giantism. So within Africa, within different regions, one or two countries are economically substantially bigger than others. And there's always the risk that the smaller countries look at these bigger ones with a degree of skepticism, a degree of jealousy, a degree of nervousness. And very often in these kind of arrangements, the economics make sense, but politically it might be more uncomfortable, more difficult in achieving the ultimate success. But I think we also need to bear in mind that a free trade agreement is a necessary but not sufficient condition for Africa's future growth trajectory. It's an enabling factor, but in and of itself and all by itself, it's not a magic wand that will create overnight success for all countries. There are other factors, other structural factors that need to also be addressed going forward.
All right, thank you so much, Professor. But then let's look at the role of the private sector, Professor. Now, how do you think that they can also come in, or what part do you think they should be playing in terms of they having the metal, they're having the financial capacity, but may not have gained inroad into the provisions of the AfCFTA? So looking at the member states and the different mechanics of the private sector in these different member states, how do you think they can also be incorporated into the implementation of the AfCFTA? Yeah, Professor Andre. Okay, I probably might just.
Anything you're saying there?
Professor Andre, can you hear me? All right, maybe pending the time that
Every
the
second word I
professor,
can hear.
pending the time the professor gets its audio quality right, let me just quickly put that question to Gospel and ask what you think the role of the private sector should be looking at these member countries.
Yes, I mean, the role of the private sector is really, really, we can look at it from different dimensions. And I also don't think that the private sector has been involved enough in the context of the growth, competitiveness, and trade trajectory of many African nations. And then when you want to look at that, it will be technically how has the private sector been positioned in terms of partnership with government, with institutions, as well as the MSMEs who are directly involved at the core of trading activities, as the case may be. So what we've seen over time is a private sector trying to support the ecosystem from a CSR standpoint. But that goalpost needs to shift in terms of we need to start rethinking how we remodel and embrace, especially the MSMEs, to become part of the holistic growth process of the economy. So how are we supporting the SME ecosystem? What support do they need? What financial support do they need? What technical support do they need? How do we complement and close the entrepreneurial education gap? Not just in context to the individual nations, but in trading across nations and all that. Then how can the private sector also go steps ahead to facilitate deals with governments across, within and across borders in terms of within the African context again. So the role of the private sector has to be clearly defined. But again, context governments, take for instance, Nigeria, for example, has to be able to define what the role of the private sector is within its national industrial or its national trade policy. Many of the African nations do not really have a very comprehensive, modern, and contemporary trade policy that robustly encompasses the private sector and identifies what their roles are and all of that. And secondly, also is the fact that we have a strong service sector. All right, there are a lot of players and MSMEs in the service sector who can contribute to the AfCFTA construct and the competitiveness of the region. All right, so how do we begin to tie up players in the service sector and match them up with private sector institutions who are doing more in that regard? So it's a very comprehensive thought process that needs to go into, first and foremost, the national trade policy and service industrial plan of that context, and then weaving it both across sub-regions and the holistic region. So but I believe that the private sector has a lot of role to play in the context of growth and development of the region, but it has to be clearly defined, and government has to see the private sector as a support institution, all right, and as a complementary effort towards reaching the same goal, as the case may be.
All right, let me go back to Professor Andre. Are you there? Hello, Professor.
I can hear you, yes. I've switched to my video to save some time.
Okay.
Yes,
so,
can you hear me?
All right. So let me pick it from the angle of where Gospel talked about Africa not having a robust trade policy. And looking at data, when you look at the intra-African exports volumes and values that we have, 16.6% of total exports were said to have been recorded in 2017, compared to Europe that had 68.1%, Asia had 59.4%, America had 55%, and Oceania had 7%. So when you talk about having a robust trade policy for Africa, why is it, or what are the factors responsible for the poor indices or the inability of Africa to have developed that kind of trade policy that improves its value in terms of trade, volume and value, and what can be exported to other countries?
Yes, I think it's part of the age-old story of Africa, and I'm generalizing awfully, African countries produce lots of resources, different kinds of resources, but unfortunately we don't add enough value ourselves. So we're producing stuff for the export market, but really other countries in the continent don't necessarily want to buy that stuff. They're not looking for resources, they're looking for manufactured goods. And if I may just add on to this point and the earlier point made by my colleague, I think we should also look at not only private sector involvement, but the involvement of the non-African private sector. What I mean by that is, we all know, we go back to basic economics, that savings are crucial to finance investment, and investment is needed for economic growth. We don't have a very big savings pool in Africa, so we need to attract foreign savings. Now, historically, a lot of that came in the form of aid. But aid can be self-defeating. aid can become an addiction. So I think we need to move away from the idea of relying upon foreign aid and be very careful about borrowing money. We rather want to attract good, solid foreign direct investment. And for that to happen, we need to remind ourselves of the age-old saying that investment moves to those places where it is well rewarded and well treated. So we then ask ourselves, what can we in Africa offer the world? And some of the answers, I think, are important. We can offer the world, we've just been talking about it, the largest free trade agreement on this planet. We can offer the world a large population which is growing to the extent that by 2050, 26% of the world's population will be in Africa. And that also means 26% of the world's consumers will be in Africa. That's a big consumer market. We can offer the world a growing middle income group, still small, but growing quite rapidly. We can offer the world, very importantly, youthfulness. You know, I think both my colleague and I happen to be in the UK at the moment. In Europe, the big concern is the rapid aging of populations and workforces. In Africa, we have a remarkably young population, young workforce, and the potential for a demographic dividend. But for that potential to come to fruition, obviously, all the young people now and in the future need to be properly and appropriately educated and skilled. So these are some of the requirements, basic requirements, along with free trade. But I don't think free trade all by itself is the solution to all of our questions. It's along with, as I say, having the ability to be competitive, to produce something the world wants, to do so productively, attractively, and using economies of scale.
All right, Gospel, at this point, when you talk about the issue of securing loans, finances from foreign institutions, as it were, to drive Africa's trade, and of course, seeing how to bring about some foreign direct investments into Africa to improve intra-Africa trade to up to about 40%. Do you think that is the wisest thing to do? Do you think it is doable? Or you think that that could be a major instrument that can catalyze intra-African trade to a projection that might be even beyond 40%, as it were? What do you think?
No, I'm not saying loans at all. I'm saying be wary of loans. Loans can be very dangerous. It passes the burden onto future generations. Foreign direct investment is the thing we're looking for.
Okay, so let me also get Gospel's reaction also to see what it thinks about that.
Yes, I'm very much in sync with Andre. FDIs are very critical, and they are the center of unlocking the growth potentials that we currently have right now in Africa. However, they don't just happen. We've seen FDI, really drop over the last 1 year in Nigeria. Capital inflows really dropped extensively, and that has been as a result of the key structural issues that has been in place, and it's literally very similar to many African countries as well. All right, the macroeconomic environment is really volatile. We've also seen how much we've lost in terms of growth patterns and growth prospects. For Nigeria, for instance, we've seen the incoherent nature of policies by the monetary institutions, and that fiscal indiscipline as well, and all of these elements come together to build a perception of investor confidence when it comes to FDI and the likes, and even local investments as well. All right, so there's need to fix the investment climate, the doing business climate within, again, context, also across the sub-regions and the regions. The reason why I've been emphasizing heavily on context is because a team is only as strong as its weakest link. All right, so if we want a level of trade growth and development within the region that would also impact on development, on growth to a large extent and prosperity, it means that the different silos of nations involved in that trade mix have to be strong, relatively strong, and contributing something to the table, in the real sense of things. So technically would mean that the investment climate in these different countries are relatively impressive or relatively fair enough to attract investments, as well as improve or inspire some form of private sector participation within the process. And until we begin to do that en masse to scale, technically, we may not be able to, plug in the necessary support processes, the technical investment that need to go in, to facilitate trade in the region. I also agree that free trade in itself is it's not the solution technically. We need to do more around how do we unlock the productivity drivers in our context and in our sub-regions and regions as well. All right, what does productivity mean for us as a nation, nation and as a context. I mean, human capital in terms of human resource and the young population, it's significantly high. We have the highest consumer market in the world. But then again, we need to be careful that that consumer market does not, automatically become a consumption market, which it has been to a large extent. So how do we move from a consumption-driven local, sub-national, sub-local, sub-regional and regional market to a productively driven market? I want to stage a situation where the chocolates produced in Nigeria can be consumed in Tesco, London, in Zurich, Switzerland, and foreigners are interested, to identify with our products and services as the case may be. So it's more around fixing the home climate and inspiring private sector participation to scale investment potentials to unlock trade and growth in this regard.
Well, Gospel, that is quite interesting. Let me just put this across to Professor Andre, because you talked about weak and incoherent policy statements. And we have countries, African countries, who are bedeviled with this, coupled with dwindling revenue. You talk about poor credit score, and of course, the issue of rising debt for these African countries. But one thing that is important that has to do with financing or bringing this particular AfCFTA into materialization is the issue of funds, money. So, Professor Andre, with these African countries having these issues or bottlenecks, as it were, how do you think they'll be able to raise the finance to galvanize the process of these particular agreements? How do you think the member states will be able to raise the needed funds to drive this AfCFTA conversation?
Yeah, I presume you're talking about government bonds, government borrowing. And again, I would be very careful about governments borrowing money, especially the World Bank or the IMF. It can be very useful, but as we all know, you subject yourself to the possibility of conditionality. Subject yourself to the possibility that the lenders, whether that be the IMF, the World Bank, or these days Chinese banks, ultimately, eventually, informally, take over control of how you run your economy. That's why I said a bit earlier, loans can be useful, but only if they're used for the right reasons, if they're used to enhance capacity, enhance infrastructure, and the like. Which brings me back to my earlier point. First prize ought to be attracting foreign direct investment from the private sector across the planet and from each other, obviously. Again, I think we must stress again, as has been said so articulately, that we are a continent of more than 50 countries. Each country is different. It's different in terms of climate, history, legacies, politics, ideologies, and the like. So you're putting together 54, 55 countries, which is great, but I like the word my colleague's been using, context, context, context. One size doesn't fit all. And bear in mind that investors out there are looking for good returns and good treatment of their investment. And we in Africa are competing with 170 other countries on this planet who are having exactly the same conversation. We have to ask ourselves, what can we offer investors that other countries can't, or what can we offer just as well as other countries? And there's such a wide range of answers to this question, ranging from pure economics. I mentioned our youthfulness as an asset. We need to be able to offer the promises of stability, economic stability, political stability. We need to be able to offer the promises that if they do invest in our country, they will be able to disinvest if they so wish. We need to be able to offer them the prospects of future growth, which I think is there. But again, it's not a one-size-fits-all story, and that is why having this joint collaboration between countries is important. Each country in Africa individually is too small.
All right, thank you so much, Professor Andre. We know that Africa's trade is actually robust, and what is important is having that set of mechanics and the right kind of mix in terms of direct investments, the investors, and the resources that are needed to drive growth for the African continent. Thank you so much, Professor Andre Rowe, and of course, the Gospel Obele for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Now, as nations across Africa gear up to actually embrace the transformative potential of the AfCFTA, it's actually hoped that the agreement will help accelerate trade, investment, and development across the continent, and that would help unlock countless opportunities for its people and, of course, businesses on the African continent. Thank you so much for joining us on this special edition of business economy discussion on New Central Television. Of course, it's Africa Day, and we will continue to celebrate Africa. My name is Lekon Obanjo. Thank you so much for being there. We'll continue with other broadcasts on the show. Do not go away. We still have more to come for you.